Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Horses Advocate podcast. This is Doc T. I am going to be releasing soon my Advanced Equine Nutrition course. And I've decided to do this at my own expense, mental expense, I should say, because it's been a real brain burner. Because as I dig deeper into this whole idea of what nutrition should be, I found that the basic equine nutrition course, which you can find at thehorsesadvocate.com, covered just about everything that you as horse owners need. But I thought that there might be some people listening to this podcast who need to dig a little bit deeper. So I decided to become an armchair physiologist. And what I mean by that is, while I don't have all the answers, I have some of the answers in more detail. Now, there are going to be smarter people out there who are listening to this who are going to say, no, you're wrong there, or that's not right, or I'm close. I understand that. I'm not perfect. But when it comes to trying to figure out just what's happening in our horses' bodies, I knew I had to go a little bit deeper for some of you. So at the risk of going a little bit overboard and maybe losing you, I want to review the 10 chapters that I have that will help us understand it a little bit better. So here we go. Let's just start with chapter 1, where I talk about energy balance. I talk about the first law of thermodynamics, which states calories in or consumed equals calories out or expended. And that works for non-biological systems, but in horses, there are other factors that affect both sides of the equation. And I discuss what these factors are. They're basically boiled down to what kind of foods are we putting in there, and what amounts, and what time frame we're putting them in. The stresses that we put upon our horses, and the diseases that are coming out of these imbalances and stresses that we see as horse owners. We just want to become a little bit more empowering or empowered to go up to our horse and do what I call adjust the dials. Now, I've talked about this in the past, but adjusting the dials is something that older people like me understand, and newer people like you may not understand. You just click on a button and you don't have to tune anything. It's spot on. But in the olden days, to get a radio signal from radio waves that are coming through the atmosphere, we had to fine tune to make sure that it became clear. So I don't know what new example I can use or new expression that would explain adjusting the dials. But you have to understand that you have to tweak things just to make things right. And sometimes what's good for one horse is not good for another. So I go over that. I also briefly talk about the third law of thermodynamics, which is basically entropy. In a nutshell, what that means is everything that we see in our world has a shape, a color, an odor, a texture, and all of that requires energy to continue that to occur. And if we took all the energy out of that, it wouldn't even register on a thermometer that it has a temperature. It's called absolute zero if you look at the Kelvin scale. And most of you know Fahrenheit or Celsius, but the third one is Kelvin, which measures everything from zero, where there's no vibration, there's no energy. It's total what they call chaos. And I go into that to understand that our horses, on a moment-by-moment basis, is doing everything it can to keep what I call the lights on, or to energize that particular cell to do its job. And I go over that by discussing what air and water and the sugars, not just glucose, but all the sugars do, and the fats, also known as fatty acids, and the amino acids in the form of proteins, and how they interact with the horse. Because a horse can make some of these things. It can't make air, but it can make water. It can make glucose. It can make fat, and it can make a lot of the amino acids without ever having to eat anything. But there are certain amino acids they have to eat that we call essential. And obviously we need air. You cut the air off of any living thing, plant or animal, doesn't matter, and they will die. Air is that important, so important that we don't even store it in our bodies. So the idea behind this is to expand your mind to not look at a one moment in time explanation of what nutrition is, but rather every moment in time, like a movie, is being played at the cellular level. That's bringing energy in the form of food into a system that extracts that energy from food and converts it into through some process into energy that goes from chemical to electrical. And those sparks are stored and used as needed with the output of carbon dioxide and water. So everything that comes in comes out as carbon dioxide and water. And in this flux or flow of energy, there are points that if they're not, how do I say this? If they're not moving properly, if they're not efficient, if there's some sort of blockage in this flow, we're going to go from a nice gentle stream coming down to either a torrent of water coming in that the stream can't handle and it overflows, which is the best way of describing what eating more than you need turns into body fat. Or on the opposite, if you're controlling the diet, but the outflow is blocked for whatever reason, you've got a disease, or there's not enough exercise, or the energy cells aren't efficient any longer as in older age, you're going to get a backup of this flow, and that also floods the area and turns either into body fat or other marked or things we can measure. So as veterinarians, we come in and measure that, and we're basically asking ourselves through blood work or any other modality, we're asking, is the flow of energy going through there properly? And if it is, we say your horse is healthy, everything's fine, nothing needs to be done. But as we tend to measure things like excess body fat or joint dysfunction or metabolic syndrome with values of insulin or neuropathies where we measure ACTH and we say your horse has Cushing's, all those are indicating that your river, your little stream is overflowing, is flooding into the system and wreaking havoc. You no longer have an efficient movement of food going through the body and coming out as carbon dioxide and water. And that's the basis of my first chapter. If that flood of water affects organs, they eventually die. A great example of that is in humans with cardiovascular disease, where we have malfunctions of that. We also have brain conditions that occur, and we have lamenesses. So all of that is all about energy balance. In the next chapter, I go into DNA and protein synthesis, because to build this thing called a horse in front of us, we need to have a template that will instruct the cells to build proteins, and the proteins combine in a certain way to build the tissues that we have, whether it's bone, connective tissues, muscles, or the hair or the hooves, the immune system, the neurotransmitters, the brain that collects our thoughts, the transport mechanisms. All of these are proteins, and they come out of DNA. I find it fascinating. This one actually fascinated me. They said that only 2% of DNA makes all the proteins on the horse. The other 98% do something else. But we have to understand that all the DNA in total, I mean, if all the DNA that's in your horse, there's only 2% that's specific to that horse. With the other ones, that, if expressed, would turn that creation into you or me, into a cat, into a fish, into an insect, into a snake or a reptile. It will even be able to turn them into all the plants that we see, because the DNA of plants and horses and everything is pretty much the same. We only express a small part of it that makes this individual thing that we're seeing, a horse in this case, your horse specifically. And that kind of shocked me that 50% of my DNA is shared with a banana. It just blows my mind. But what I found fascinating and obvious is when you look at your horse, you're seeing 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a mouth, and a poop hole, just like you have. And that tube that connects the mouth to the poop hole, the anus, is put together differently because the horse's DNA decided to make a huge hindgut, whereas yours and I made a simple stomach, where cattle makes a rumen. And so they need different foods, but the processes turn out to be the same because the requirement at the cell level is for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And the DNA knows how to do that. I talk about how proteins are made by taking a recipe that is in this major section called food and, well, called proteins. And they're making a copy of it that's called RNA. And that RNA goes to a section of the cell that transcribes that, or translates that recipe, if you will, into the protein that they're asking for. So it's like a restaurant that has 100 different entrees and appetizers and desserts. And that is all coming from something called food that can be made with ingredients. And we're saying, okay, at this restaurant, here are all the foods that we make. So that's the DNA that you're going to copy. And then the cell says, I want to make apple pie. So it goes in and takes that section of DNA, and then it makes a blueprint, and it goes to the cells that are in charge of making apple pies. And over here, another section makes, the soup, and it's specific. And in this transcription and translation of the major code, you can get some defects. And it's interesting because those defects are constantly being repaired in systems that we all have. And a lot of the DNA doesn't get made right, or the RNA, or the proteins, the final product comes, and the chef tastes it, and he says, oh, this is garbage, throw it out, and it goes back. Whereas other ones say, this is almost perfect, we're going to let it go out. And another one, the chef was told, instead of stirring, maybe he'll try folding, which is apparently 2 different ways of mixing ingredients. And so he changes the recipe, and that's called epigenetics. So I think that's pretty interesting. But the bottom line is, every horse is an individual, and there's no one size that fits all for nutrition in any horse out there. The third chapter is determining how much to feed horses. So there I go into the little bit of science of what a calorie is. And calories are very confusing because they make a small C calorie versus a large C calorie, which is 1,000 little C calories. It's just confusing. And of course, if you're not in the British or English or imperial ways, most of science is turning over to joule, which is not the jewel that you wear on jewelry, but a joule, which is the measurement of work that's done relative to the energy put in, how much joules are needed. So we're all turning over to joules and getting rid of calories because calories are too confusing. But I know you guys are confused because I know I'm confused, and I'm trying to make this not confusing. So we'll just stick with calories. So we talk about the basal metabolic rate, which is the energy that's needed to keep the horse alive. So if the horse just stood there and did absolutely nothing, there would be a certain amount of energy that horse has to eat every day to keep him going. So then we have the sudden increase in needs in energy because something spooks it and it has to run, or you're increasing the training the horse is going through in the sport that they're in, or we have changes in seasons that require the horse to add more fat because winter's coming and it's cold. So that alters the basal metabolic rate, and we have to adjust the amount of food coming into the horse to match that amount of energy that's going out. And if we do it right, the horse neither gains nor loses body fat, because body fat, by definition, represents excess energy consumed that's being stored. Remember, calories in equals calories out in the first chapter. It means calories that come in equals calories that are stored or are used or are eliminated. Those are the three things. So we have to look at that. So we look at the body condition score, we look at the top line score, and most importantly, we physically back up and observe the horse. We observe the horse's demeanor. Is it constantly hungry, or does it act satiated? Does it sleep well, or is he restless? You know, we have to look at each horse individually and constantly adjust those dials with the food that's coming in so we don't get flooding of our stream, so everything that's going out is being efficient. So I talk about that, and I have a warning: avoid gimmicks and slick marketing. I just spent a moment watching an advertisement that was done by Dr. Marty. And if you've been listening to my podcast, you know I interviewed Dr. Marty, another Cornell vet, who has his own dog food, Dr. Marty's Dog Foods. And he started off by saying, wait a minute, what's going on with these foods? Why are these dogs keep getting sick? And he boiled it down to most dog foods have inflammatory ingredients. And this is what I've been saying all along. We have inflammatory ingredients. We're putting two and two together to make some sort of food for our horses. We're calling it a senior feed, or feed specifically for your sport or level of activity, like lactating or your growing foal. And they keep adjusting the dials, but what we don't understand is they, meaning the grain companies that we see, and you know, this just doesn't sit right with them, but it's the truth. They have a lot of waste products that are put into our horses' grains, where they're basically asking us to eliminate for them. If it is true that we should be eating unprocessed foods, as many people from your neighbor all the way up to politicians and very, very smart individuals like Casey Means, if you're listening to her and her brother talk about this, they're basically saying that if you're eating processed foods, you're going to become ill. And a lot of us believe that, and yet we pour our food out of a bag that's been processed with 20 or 30 ingredients. And I like to just always mention at this point that there's a study done where a chemical, a polyphenol, remember everything's chemicals, not all chemicals are bad, but a polyphenol, which is a specific chemical inside things like fruits, dark colored fruits, etc. There's this polyphenol in something called cocoa. We all heard of cocoa. And they mix that cocoa with a strawberry and blended it all together and gave it to people to drink. And they later measured for this polyphenol in their blood, and they found it, and all was good. So after a washout period, they brought these people back and measured. They drank a mix of this cocoa with a banana. So instead of a strawberry, it's a banana. Those are two ingredients, cocoa and strawberry, and this time cocoa and banana. They mix it and measure for this polyphenol, and they couldn't find it. Because when you mix cocoa with bananas, something happens in the mix of those two ingredients that doesn't make that polyphenol available in the blood, so it's never absorbed, or it's destroyed, or whatever. But the point is, whenever you mix two or more ingredients together, you're not getting the benefits of that specific food. So keep that in mind when you pour a bag full of 20 or 30 different ingredients made in other countries and no guarantee of what's in it. All right, the fourth chapter is amino acids as essential nutrients. Now, or protein actually as an essential nutrient. Because protein seems to be more complicated for people, we tend not to think about protein. We're constantly talking about sugar and non-structural or structural carbohydrates of hay. We're talking about soaking hay to get the sugars out, but people are afraid to feed protein. And that's the kiss of death, basically. The kiss of illness and falling apart in horses as well as humans and all animals. We have to eat enough protein, whether you're vegetarian or carnivore or omnivore. It makes no difference. And the reason is because every cell in our body is constantly being rebuilt. So let's just say a muscle cell at some point just gets totally degraded and a new muscle cell is built to replace it. And so every day there's a certain amount of amino acids that are now turned loose from their storage sites. And the storage sites are muscles and all other proteins. And that group of free-floating amino acids are usually reassembled into new proteins. Some of them are also converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis in the liver. And in humans, in a natural environment, although I don't know what natural means, they think that about 15% of about 300 grams of amino acids that are constantly being turned over get converted into glucose. I also want you to think of every time your farrier rasps off or nips off hoof, that's protein going on the ground. Every time you clip your horse's body because you're showing it or it's in a hot environment, all that hair that's being left on the ground is protein that's lost. And you have to replace that. It doesn't appear magically. And there's a group of proteins I go into, or amino acids I go into called essential. But then I also talk about conditional and non-essential amino acids. And non-essential are amino acids that the body can make. And conditional are those that are made under certain circumstances, but they're still made by the horse from essential amino acids. So it's important to get them, and you have two sources, natural sources and manufactured sources. And I still say in the manufactured sources, I don't trust them. I trust nature. I trust how they're being built. And remember, if you're worried about genetically modified food, it's hard to get away from that now. But all food, genetically modified or not, is broken down in the acid bath of the stomach and certain enzymes that break them down into smaller parts and into their individual amino acids. And genetic modification just means that we change the order of those amino acids, but nobody's changing the amino acids. So you're still getting high quality amino acids coming in there. So feeding high quality protein sources to your horse is so important. Remember, carnivores can eat protein in the form of meat, and our horses that are obligate vegetarians, they have to get it from a broad variety of plants, because plants don't store a lot of protein that can be absorbed by the horse. The best, I think, is about 50% in most grasses and legumes. So you have to feed a lot of hay or pasture to get this equal amount of protein of a steak. And the problem with that is to eat that amount of protein from grasses, you're also going to be consuming a lot of calories, which is going to put a lot of weight on. So your horse is out there eating all summer, just his head down on the grass, consuming everything. He is, if allowed to eat a broad variety of plants during their migration, the horse would be able to get all the amino acids it needs, but it's also going to consume a lot of calories. So in the winter time, the calories are going to drop off because they don't have that rich a pasture, or there's snow covering it, and then the horse or the grass is dormant, so the grass isn't going to get protein from that, but it's not going to get the calories from the carbohydrates either. So you have to be careful of that. I talk about something called a catabolic crisis, which describes starvation. If you're starved, you're basically in a crisis where all the muscles on your body are going to be consumed to the point that you die. But there's a paradox that occurs with excessive food intake. And I go over that and how excessive food intake will actually increase gluconeogenesis from amino acids. And that leads to a catabolic crisis. It's a term they're using in geriatric patients of humans who go into a nursing home or into a hospital because they're injured, they've fallen down, broken a bone, because they've already lost their muscles. And then when they're in there, their appetite decreases, and the diet that the hospitals feed don't have enough protein, and so these older people basically fall apart. And this is why death comes to 25% of all people older than 65 years old who have fallen and broken a hip. They just never recover. The next chapter is about fats and carbohydrates as non-essential nutrients. And basically, the horse can make all the fat it wants. All they have to do is eat glucose in excess. And they can actually make all the glucose they need. And the glucose can be distributed throughout the body, but the liver is very good at breaking down carbohydrates. So I talk about how glucose is broken down from starch in plants, and free glucose in the blood travels escorted with insulin. If it doesn't get escorted, it's going to damage cells, particularly enzymes, because glucose touching proteins goes through a process that destroys or damages it. And this includes DNA. So the more glucose you eat, the greater chance that insulin isn't going to be produced enough. And this is why type 1 diabetics have such a problem, because they have to get that glucose under control. I also try to remind you that in a normal person, or a person with normal blood glucose of 100 milligrams per deciliter, they have about 1 teaspoon of free sugar in all of their blood throughout their body. If you drained all the blood out, put it in a bucket, took all the free sugar out of it, it would equal about 1 teaspoon. That's how regulated, or how much glucose is bound to insulin. But what's even more just mind-boggling is when blood glucose in a human goes up above 125 milligrams per deciliter. In other words, its rise is just 25 milligrams per deciliter. That difference is about 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar. So the difference between a normal person and a person with type 2 diabetes is in total about 1/4 or a little bit more of sugar, of teaspoon of sugar, which is just, it blows your mind when you think about it. That's how much we control that. We also understand that glucose can flow into cells, most cells, using an insulin-dependent transport called GLUT4. But there are certain parts of the muscle during exercise and certain parts of the brain that don't need that GLUT4 transport. They can just freely flow into the cell. And that's very interesting, because if you have inflammation of the cell membrane or the blood-brain barrier, you're still going to get decreased glucose going into that area, and that can lead to behavioral problems. They're seeing that in humans. And of course, if you have insulin resistance, it's also going to affect uptake of glucose into all these cells that require insulin. So that's one thing unique about glucose. On the flip side, you've got fat that can go in and out freely. Let me move on to the chapter 6, cell metabolism of glucose and fatty acids. And here I discuss something called the Randle cycle, which measures the concentration of glucose and fats in the form of triglycerides, both inside the cell and outside the cell. And based on the relative differences, they will set up certain processes that will move these substrates either into the cell or they'll reject them so they stay in the blood. And this is where insulin resistance occurs. So when sugar comes to a cell in abundance and there's more than enough sugar in the cell, the Randle cycle is going to set things up that will move glucose away through insulin resistance, and it will also not use fat in the cell. It's very interesting. But when there's no glucose outside the cell, so the greater concentration of glucose is inside the cell, this cell will start to use up that glucose inside the cell to a point where it says, hey, I need some help here. And when that happens, fat will start to be used from inside the cell. Fat is stored in cells in these droplets. And when those droplets start to shrink, now the fat from outside will come in. Now, fat's not going to be released from the cell, apart from the body, if insulin is flowing around. So if you have glucose in the diet, you're going to have insulin. It's going to prevent lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat coming into the body that can go into the cells. So everything is the checks and balance, which is absolutely amazing. Then I go and talk about 3 different situations of substrate availability. That's what I call it anyway. You have the seasonally high sugar diet, which is, growing grass in the spring, abundant grass through the summer, and having pastures with winter grasses that resist winter. They will also have some growth in the fall, so they'll have high sugar diet. But the bottom line is, in winter, there's no grass available. So it's the seasonally high sugar diet. The second is the seasonally low sugar diet, which is winter, when there's no sugar available, and what the horse does to counteract that. And then, of course, the third one is a continuously high sugar diet, which is what most Americans or modern people do throughout the world. They have food that's available 24/7, 365, and we've turned that over to our horses. And I go into exactly what happens in each one of these, and I look at the Randle cycle and how it switches back and forth in these particular environments. The basic takeaway is that insulin resistance is happening on and off, moment by moment. So a cell could be insulin resistant and a moment later allow glucose in. And it's not like all shut down. It could be, well, we're only going to let in half. So measuring for insulin resistance, where we actually physically see the change on blood values, we are well beyond the beginning stages of insulin resistance. It's like we're trying to close the door, but the horse has already left the barn, and we're going to do everything we can to get the horse back in the barn, and it becomes too hard. But it's so easy to keep feeding these horses more and more and more, and not honor these cycles that are there for only seasonal and temporary use. Chapter 7 is really interesting. Here I talk about something called lactate. And lactate is a molecule that is 1/2 of a glucose molecule. And this chapter is really long because it is so important. When we eat glucose, when your horse eats glucose, it goes through the first layer of cells in the gut wall. This is long before insulin shows up. It goes through that first layer, and most of that glucose is divided in two through a process called glycolysis, and it makes lactate. And lactate is the actual fuel that we use in all our cells to create all the abundant ATP or energy that we need. So lactate is stored in plants as glucose that is glued together and stored as starch. So starch is how plants store glucose. Animals store glucose as glycogen, and glucose is actually a storage of lactate. So glucose has to go into the cell anywhere in the body, And it's first thing it does is it splits in two and makes lactate. Now this is absolutely different information that I'm giving you than what you probably learned in biochem. And it's interesting because they've known this for about 30 years, yet even when I do a search on the internet for something like what is glycolysis, what is the breakdown product of glucose, they'll tell you it's pyruvate. And we're now realizing that pyruvate is there, and pyruvate and lactate are very similar, just like one or two different element positions. But it basically goes into lactate, and it's lactate that's going to the mitochondria and being brought into the mitochondria to produce abundant amounts of ATP. And that just blows your mind if you think about it. Basically, when you're eating, your body is trying to get access to lactate, and it does that by splitting up glucose. And glucose can come in many different forms of food, but its job is to go to lactate. And if you do a oral glucose tolerance test, what they do is they give a measured amount of glucose, and then about 30 minutes later, they'll look to see how high glucose and insulin have risen, glucose specifically, and then how long it stays elevated before it disappears. But what they found out was in half the time, the amount of lactate is through the roof. I mean, within 5 minutes to 15 minutes, it goes from zero lactate to boom, or normal levels to high levels, which tells us that glucose is being broken down into lactate. Now, before your eyes glaze over and say, oh my God, we're moving into territories we don't understand, you need to understand that lactate is everything. Lactate is so important. It does not have to be attached to insulin. It can go between cells. It maintains the pH of the cell. It does not cause lactic acidosis. That has been disproven. And the aches and pains in your muscles after exercise or you cramp up has nothing to do with acidosis occurring in your muscle cells. And in fact, the pH inside the muscle cell is slightly basic, 7.34, I think, or 7.38. But lactate is actually the preferred fuel of all muscles in all cells. By storing glucose as glycogen, it spares blood glucose and insulin-bound glucose for use in the brain. So let's put it this way. If you're a horse and you're just out there grazing, that food is coming in, it's being broken down to lactate. Lactate's going out through the body and fueling the cells to keep everything moving. Now, if we didn't have glucose stored as glycogen in our cells, and suddenly a wild animal comes around and attacks our horses, and they are bolting and they're running at the highest rate that they possibly can, if they didn't have storage of glucose as glycogen, the animal would suck down all the glucose in the blood and completely drain out the system. The brain would black out and the animal would fall to the ground to be eaten by the threat. But because lactate is immediately being made in the gut lining and going and being distributed, and that's keeping all the processes on, when we do have that emergency, now they can go into glycogen and use that, so we still have glucose going to the brain so we can still think. I think it's genius. All right, let's see, what else can I say about lactate? If the cell makes more lactate than it needs, and that means the mitochondria only uses lactate, it doesn't use glucose, it uses lactate. You can store some lactate in the cells, not too much. It's just whatever's in there. It can be shared between muscle fiber types in a cell-cell lactate shuttle, which is kind of interesting. It can freely travel in the blood. it is the primary fuel for all neurons. Neurons cannot use glucose. Glucose cannot get into a neuron, which are the brain cells. They can go into the supportive cells, glucose can, and glucose can be broken down to lactate. Then lactate will leave the support cell, the astrocyte, and it will diffuse into the neurons, and that's what charges things up. Interestingly, lactate uses a specific transport mechanism called MCT, monocarboxylic transport. And that same transport, it's on all cells, that same transport mechanism also allows ketones in. And this is why if sugar is low and your body isn't taking in enough sugar and it starts breaking out body fat, the metabolism of fat creates ketones, and ketones can go into the neurons and keep the brain active. Again, brilliant, I think. Any excess, and also there's a Cori cycle where excess lactate that isn't going to be used for anything else will actually be transported to the liver and recombined with another lactate, becomes 2 pyruvates, becomes 1 molecule of glucose. So lactate is a form of gluconeogenesis, which I found fascinating. Okay, let's see what else. Oh, yeah. Mitochondria, their fuel is lactate. And as long as lactate's around, fats will not be used. The use of lactate will prevent the use of fat. But when lactate disappears or becomes low, that allows the mitochondria to switch fuels over to fat. And that flexibility is so essential. But in a high glucose diet, that glucose keeps triggering the mitochondria to keep working. Unfortunately, as the mitochondria uses lactate to make energy, and glucose keeps coming in through glycolysis in the cell cytoplasm to make more lactate, they make reactive oxygen species. It's oxidative stress, and that decreases the efficiency of the mitochondria. So it's important to stop eating at some point and to rest, to reduce those oxidative stress, to improve the efficiency of the mitochondria. That's really important. Exercise increases lactate production, but it also increases the amount of muscle fibers that you have, and within each muscle fiber are more mitochondria that can use lactate. In addition, the mitochondria become dense, which means they increase the number of folds inside the mitochondria where this metabolic Krebs cycle works. And so they can take in more lactate and use the excess lactate. And they also increase the number of enzymes that are necessary for the Krebs cycle to occur. Another interesting thing is excess lactate from exercise will suppress ghrelin. Ghrelin is the hormone of hunger that comes from our brain. So most people who exercise know that after exercise, the last thing they want to do is eat, which will help get rid of the excess free radicals in the cells that are causing oxidative stress. Another interesting thing is lactate will come out of muscle fibers and go to other muscle fibers that need lactate. So fast twitch fibers make a lot of lactate, but they can't use it. So they share it through a process where it just leaves that cell and it's taken up from other cells. But more importantly, the mitochondria within all these cells are constantly talking to the others. So it makes what's called an energy grid. So muscles are actually in synchrony. And if there are more mitochondria that are getting excess stress, that's going to affect all the mitochondria. So it's going to cause the other mitochondria to slow down, and it works in unison. I thought that was pretty amazing. And I could talk about slow twitch and fast twitch fibers and the difference between them, and the cell-cell lactate shuttle. And that's pretty much it. Let's go on to chapter 8. Fructose and its master effect on survival. I had a couple of podcasts on fructose, which I found fascinating. Fructose is a sugar that looks similar to glucose. It's like holding up two keys for your front door lock and your back door lock, and they're different, but they look the same. And sometimes you put the wrong key in and it just won't turn. Well, that's how similar fructose and glucose are, but they do two different things. And glucose, we already have been told, breaks down into two lactate molecules, and that goes into the Krebs cycle, and that creates a ton of energy. But fructose goes into the Krebs cycle, and because of an enzyme that it has called fructokinase, it prevents the ATP to ADP back to ATP cycle. It prevents the production of ATP. And what it does is increases something called uric acid. And uric acid is helpful if winter is coming because it'll add body fat, it'll increase blood pressure to help with dehydration, and the animal becomes dehydrated because all the water that's normally used for metabolism is now being stored as fat and glycogen. So you become slightly dehydrated. Through several processes, including increased fat production, you're going to get more low-grade inflammation. So it starts sending out some of these factors to get the animal charged up and ready, so when a bad stress comes along, such as a virus or you get a bacterial infection, the inflammation system is primed, ready to go. So all of that is helping this horse survive in winter. It also changes the foraging behavior, and that's so fascinating because there's so many people looking at behavior of horses. And I think, and I haven't seen this, but if you're going to look at the behavior of horses or humans, the first thing you do is look at diet, because you can change the behavior. And some of that behavior includes aggression, food aggression, this willingness to get up and go to the kitchen in the middle of the night, or your horse banging on the stall wall, and as you come down with your feed buckets, they're lunging at the horse next door because they are so aggressive. This is my food, and they'll fight to the death for it. That's all from fructose. And a lot of that goes away when you remove fructose from the diet. So fructose is seasonally available and allows for a temporary effect. Mainly in spring and summer, you get more of these fructose, and so they keep building more and more fat. And at some point, it drives the horse into migration. And then winter comes and fructose disappears and everything calms down. And there's less fighting, less aggression. There's more conservation of energy because it is winter. And then by springtime, the body fat is reduced, normalizing blood pressure, we're assuming, because nobody's measuring blood pressure in horses. Decreased inflammation, foraging behavior becomes normalized, and their basal metabolic rate is normalized as well. But as they start to increase in the springtime, it's going to drive the horse to greener pastures. It's going to ask the horse to find a mate. It's going to give the energy the horse needs to deliver a foal, the mare to deliver a foal. And of course, the young horses are going to grow and play with all this fructose. And that's fine. Again, it's ebbing and flowing, and that's what's important. Unfortunately, and this was an eye-opening event for me, hopefully it is for you, there's the polyol pathway, which basically converts glucose into fructose. And there's 4 triggers that cause this. When you eat anything that's high in glucose, like starch, which is most of the hays and the grains that we're feeding these horses, that starch will trigger the polyol process to convert any glucose that's coming in into fructose, which causes increased weight gain, increased hypertension, and increased inflammation. And it's coming from glucose. So the horse doesn't have to actually eat fructose, it just has to eat high glycemic foods. Glycemic foods are rated on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being bad. And any food that's 70 or above will trigger this process, and that includes all grains. Second, becoming dehydrated before eating these foods because you don't have enough water available or whatever. It seems kind of rare if you have water available at all times. But in humans, if you eat the salted pretzel or the hot salted French fries before you satisfy that thirst in you, you will change the glucose of the starch of the potato and the French fries into fructose, and that's what helps increase your body fat. The third is eating umami foods, and umami foods are the savory flavors that we eat as humans. And glutamate is one of the biggest triggers. And that's why monosodium glutamate, MSG, is added to increase the savoriness of bad food. So these are small bits of protein and also yeast, because yeast is basically a bunch of protein. So if you're feeding a mixed bag of feed that has a ton of ingredients, look for yeasts. And a lot of them have either brewer's yeast or other yeasts that are in there. Those yeasts could be triggering your horse to convert glucose into fructose. So I would avoid that. And if you're a heavy beer drinker and wondering why your belly is growing, there are two reasons for it. The second I'll tell you in a little bit. But the first is that the yeasts in the beer and in the bread that you're eating will stimulate the conversion of glucose into fructose. And then the fourth trigger is living in a low oxygen environment. And what I mean by that is birds that fly over mountains in migration, or sea animals that dive deep into the ocean and holding their breath. They live in a low oxygen environment. And horses, I believe, that are box stall rested, they're not breathing. They're not getting a lot of oxygen. And that's going to trigger glucose being converted over into fructose. So do your deep breathing exercises. Try to get the horse to get a little bit of breathing in there. Get them to move around so they're exchanging the oxygen with their carbon dioxide in their lungs. I think fructose is at the root cause of equine metabolic syndrome. And it makes sense when you think about it. And we go into that. And with equine metabolic syndrome, you have excess body fat and dysfunctional metabolic processes such as insulin resistance. And it also leads to hunger. I mean, your horse, if it's constantly hungry, how can that be? You're feeding the heck out of this horse, and yet it keeps getting hungrier. The bottom line is you're triggering this food aggression. You're not triggering a lactate production. Lactate, which decreases ghrelin in the brain and decreases your appetite, is not being triggered. So you have cravings. You have a poor work ethic, and of course, breakdowns. And this moves into the next chapter, 9, called The Addiction of Sugar in Horses. And what's fascinating is when you look at brain activity in humans, there's little to no difference between the activity of the brain that is on addictive drugs such as heroin and alcohol. And there's no difference between those two and those that have a lot of sugar. When you're addicted to sugar, it's stimulating the same part of the brain. That's why all of you listening to this are saying, man, don't tell me to give up my sugar. I love my sugar. I love giving sugar to my horses. It's an addiction, and it's hard to break. And when you can't see the difference between brain functions between heroin and sugar, you know that there's a problem. In addition, one of the sequelae of eating excess sugar, at least in humans, is the development of fat within the liver. It's called fatty liver disease. And they call it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because horses don't drink alcohol. But when you compare to alcoholic fatty liver disease, it's almost impossible to tell the differences under the microscope. There are a few differences, but they're almost virtually the same. And I know when I was a student at Cornell, we fed ponies 100% ethyl alcohol in their food. and they measured the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme that you make to break down alcohol into water, because alcohol, if it's not broken down, is a toxin. But luckily we break down that toxin, and there's a reason for it, because animals that were migrating in the winter, they would find fruit on the ground that was starting to rot. And when fruit rots, it creates alcohol. And so these animals were eating fermented fruit, which was making them a little ditzy. And so they started to develop this enzyme. This is epigenetic change, to make this enzyme. And we knew that horses didn't make alcohol dehydrogenase because they're never exposed to it. So it was a good species to look at alcohol-derived fatty liver disease in these horses. Uric acid could be at the bottom line as well, because uric acid drives all this foraging behavior. So you have foraging behavior and stimulation in the brain of addictive centers, and it drives the consumer of glucose, of sugar, to do crazy things. Because in the foraging behavior, one of the things is increased risk taking. So let's say you're sitting there listening to me, and suddenly you get hungry, and you know to eat, you're going to have to walk down several blocks to a store in the dark. And normally you say, no, I'm not going to walk down there in the night. It's too risky. There are bad people out there. But if you're hungry enough, you'll say, okay, I know there's risks, but I'll take that risk. I will do what's uncomfortable. It's raining out, but I'm hungry. I'm going to move through the bad weather or the darkness. That's what uric acid does. And uric acid is a product of fructose breakdown. So it's pretty amazing. They say when it's chronic, in human mental disturbances, they include ADHD, bipolar disorder, aggression, and impulsiveness. And this is not just from fructose metabolism, but due to insulin resistance, you're getting decreased amount of energy coming to the brain, so the brain is operating on low fuel. So you have both of those happening, and you have abnormal behavior. And then they're also realizing that there's increased fructose production through this polyol pathway in the brain, and it may be at the root cause of Alzheimer's in humans, because it has a negative effect on cell energy and eventually causing neuronal death. So, we don't have cognitive loss in our horses per se, but they're seeing this in humans. And I also think that it could be one of the causes of PPID in horses, because the neurons aren't getting the fuel that they need. You have insulin resistance at the hypothalamus, because that's one of the areas that requires insulin to get glucose into it. And you have neuronal damage. So you can have a lot of these things happening. Anyway, in my life with over 50 years in horses, I'm just seeing all these mental and physical illnesses that are occurring in horses that weren't there back in the 1980s. Finally, in chapter 10, the final chapter, I unravel the complexities of stress and its impact on horses. And stress has increased. So what I go over is basically there are two forms of stress. One is the stress that requires us to act quickly to save our life. And that's from the adrenal medulla that releases adrenaline, that breaks down glucose, breaks down fat, and does everything it can to put energy available so we can motor, we can fight, or we can fly. That's what the fight and flight is. It's epinephrine. Like you're sitting here and somebody comes around the corner and surprises you, and you go, ah! And, your heart rate goes up. You tend not to see anything except what's the threat, what's my escape. You're at 100%. That's epinephrine working. But the more subtle changes that can be life-threatening, i.e. it's getting cold out, I better go shopping and find some winter clothes because I've never lived in a cold environment, or I need to go out and find food, which is not a big deal now, but it was, and it still is for a lot of people out there, where there are neighborhoods changing and there are more threats in the neighborhood, so you have to raise your cortisol levels, and that comes from the adrenal cortex. And that is a little bit slower response, but it is longer lasting. And those kind of stresses to change with the environment that either makes you move out of that neighborhood or build a resistance to that bad influence in your neighborhood, or to go out and find food, or to bundle up, which means you have to hunt and skin and use the extra furs for your clothing, whatever. That is normal stress. The problem is, and there's a word called hormesis, which is basically your set point of the amount of cortisol and epinephrine that's constantly flowing through your body. Hopefully not a lot of epinephrine and a low amount of cortisol. And everything's fine. That's called hormesis. The problem is, as every day another stress is added, it could be I'm getting older and my metabolism's failing, or I'm upping my game and doing a higher level in my sport. I'm doing more advanced exercise that's really stressing me. There's a new person in your barn that's a little bit more aggressive and the horse doesn't like it, or you just took that horse out of its environment and flew it over the ocean and plopped it in another barn where they don't even speak the language that it knows. These are all stresses that are change that set point and elevate it. And that elevated stress is called allosteric stress. So the difference between normal and what is now normal, that's allostasis. And you can change allostasis by removing all those stresses and lowering it down. That's the whole idea behind meditating, praying, having downtime. R&R is to lower that stress level to decrease all the processes that go along with higher cortisol levels. Because cortisol is very good at adding body fat and increasing blood pressure and doing all the other things that we talked about with fructose. Adding cortisol is going to add to the processes that prepare the animal for future battles. So the sudden medullary release of epinephrine says the battle is here, you need all the fuel you need. Whereas the cortical stress says the battle's coming, let's prepare. And both of those are okay. It helps us survive. The problem is, in this day and age, we keep that stress high. So we're constantly producing cortisol, which is constantly creating more lipogenesis, or the formation of body fat, and all the other things that are occurring that are not good. In addition, because it's driving all glucose into body fat, we become hungry and we eat more glucose. And that because if you're driving body fat or glucose and converting it into body fat and keeping it there and not allowing it out, then there's no fat to be used in the cell. And we're more likely to eat sugary foods, and that's what we're doing. So the sugar comes in, and that creates all these unstable elements called reactive oxygen species, and that creates oxidative stress. Then we put the horse in an environment where we have smog, which is oxidative stress, or any other kind of pollutions, or you're a smoker and you're blowing the smoke out and it sits in the barn. Why are you smoking in the barn? I don't know, but some people do, and all that will lead to more oxidative stress, and the body's not allowed to get rid of it through sleep, R&R, eliminating these things like smoking, bad music, the wind that's blowing in the winter, unblocked draft, all these things. Nobody's lowering that total body stress. So the allostasis, or the altered set point, adds to the equine metabolic syndrome in horses. So eventually, if the metabolic stress or oxidative stress in the cell gets too high, the cell will try to eat the broken parts because they'll start to break down, and they will try to get rid of them. But if it gets so bad, the cell will go through a programmed death called apoptosis, and it'll be wiped out. And what's fascinating is, I think between 50 and 70 million cells in the human body are destroyed every day through apoptosis. But they didn't tell me if they were on a good diet or not. So anyway, you don't want to be consuming excess glucose and fructose continuously in the food. You want to encourage mitochondrial flexibility to have the mitochondria use sugar or fat for energy production, and you want to eliminate all the causes of chronic stress to improve mitochondrial function. So my last note that I'm going to give you on this podcast is I want you to always think of you or your horse or anybody as a small stream. And I know most of you have seen the stream at some point in your past, and you have water coming in on one end, and it flows down a channel, a riverbed, a stream bed, and it exits the other side, and you're constantly having this flow. And you have food coming in, it's going through metabolic processes, and it's being eliminated. It's carbon dioxide and water over here. And if you have increased flow here, more than your body can handle, the banks will flood. And when it floods, you're going to have equine metabolic syndrome. You're going to have excess body fat, because that energy has to go somewhere, and it's not being allowed out because you're putting in too much. On the flip side, if you go on a diet and reduce what's coming in, but you don't resolve the blockages here, which is basically metabolic stress, then these mitochondria aren't efficient enough to get rid of the food that's coming in, so it doesn't allow the water to come in, so it backs up and overflows. So there you have flooding, or increased fat, body fat, or you have increased apoptosis, you have breakdown of cells, you have breakdown of organs, and you finally have body failure, also known as death, from just chronic inflammation over here. So you need to work on decreasing what's coming in here that's causing the problem, and you have to work on this as increasing the efficiency of the mitochondria. And there's only one way to do that I have been able to figure out, and that's to increase muscle mass and increase oxygen exchange. Because there's a TED talk where a guy took a balloon and exhaled into the balloon and blew it up, tied it off, and stuck the balloon in liquid nitrogen, which is very cold, and it shrunk the balloon and it chilled the carbon dioxide in there. And what happened was the formation of frozen carbon dioxide, which we all know as dry ice. It's very, very cold. And he rattled it around, and he says, that's weight loss. Weight loss occurs with exhaled carbon dioxide, because hydrogen doesn't weigh anything. And if you add 2 hydrogen to a water for H2O, you have the atomic weight of oxygen, 16, I think, and 2, that's a total atomic weight of 18. But if you have CO2, 2 oxygens and 1 carbon going out, you have 12 and 32, which is 44 atomic units. 44 is much more than 18. It's more than twice the weight. So the more CO2 you blow off, the more weight you actually lose. So increase CO2 loss by exercise and decrease calories coming in, and you'll get that equilibration of calories in equals calories out, reducing storage and increasing that flow, so everything's perfect. And technically, if you get that perfectly, you won't have any disease, and you'll also live forever, or at least you'll have a health span, because we all wear out. And that's the whole idea. And that's why I decided to put this thing together on science-based, rather than some sort of diet I don't know, trick that people do. We're talking about horses. We have to eliminate all the diets that people talk about in humans. We're talking about horses. They're obligate herbivores. And step one, reduce all inflammatory ingredients. It's that simple. Reduce the amount of high glycemic foods that are going in to prevent the polyol pathway from producing fructose. Soak your hay to get the sugars out, the fructose, the glucose, and the sucrose out of there. Remember, sucrose is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. That's your table sugar. So you want to get that out of there. Do whatever you can to reduce that amount of sugar in your fat horse and decrease that influx of water into your little stream of water called energy flow. So decrease inflammation, which decreases the increases outflow. And then add protein, because none of these processes will work if they don't have the materials there to build the enzymes that they need to make these processes work. And there's, I don't know, 2 to 3 billion, 1 to 3 billion proteins in every cell. That's a lot of proteins in every cell. And we're constantly making and breaking down and making them again. So you have to have protein coming in. And then write everything down. Include environmental changes, include overall behavior of your horse, and have a good understanding of what's going on with that horse. And that basically is the 2-week no grain challenge. Eliminate inflammatory foods, eliminate all grains, soak your hay if you have to, or eliminate hay if you've got pasture. Add protein, high quality protein with all the essential amino acids, and write everything down. And this Advanced Equine Nutrition course dives into the minutia of it. And if you take this course and really study it, and then take the quiz questions that I've got, so you're challenged, and join me on the membership side where we have our discussions and dig down deep, we'll all become a little bit better. And once we understand something and then own it, then you can go out and help other horses and other horse people everywhere with good science-based understanding of why diet and exercise is going to help our horses. Anyway, that's me, Doc T. I've taken enough of your time. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining me. Bye. Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.